Good morning from snowy Washington, D.C. Language is very important. What is said in the media, how it is said in the media is very important. The optics are as important. We are in an information war and have been, I submit, since the founding of this country. In the song B Movie, Gil Scott-Heron tells us, controlling your resources will control your world. The country has been surprised by the way the world looks now. They don't know if they want to be Matt Dillon or Bob Dylan. They don't know if they want to be diplomats or continue the same policy of nuclear nightmare diplomacy. Gil Scott-Heron told us John Foster Dulles ain't nothing but the name of an airport now. As he said, controlling your resources will control your world. I also believe controlling your access to information, what you hear, how you hear it, from what sources you hear it from also will control your world. What does this mean? Let's connect some dots.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. Here's the point. We have a tendency to view current events as though they happen in a vacuum, failing to understand the broader historical context in which most events occur. During each episode, my guests and I have probing, provocative, and in-depth discussions that connect the dots between these events and their broader historic context, thus enabling you to better understand and analyze the events that are impacting the global village in which we live. On today's episode, the issue before us is the movies you love, like Top Gun, Transformers, and Iron Man, the social media posts you scroll past on your phone, the shows you bring on your TV, and the endless streams on your tablet. What if they weren't just entertainment? What if they were part of a deliberate agenda to shape how you see the world, influence what you value, and control who you trust? For insight, let's turn to my guest. She's a historian and journalist whose work documents, deconstructs, and interprets eugenic themes in popular culture, identity information among African Americans, and reproductive apartheid in carceral spaces and within marginalized communities. She's the founder of Acumen Magazine and the author of In Search of Purity, Popular Eugenics and Racial Uplift Among New Negroes, 1915 to 1935. And I'm proud to say a true friend. Dr. Shantella Sherman, as always, welcome back.
Thank you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you as well. And you are joining us from snowy Washington, D.C. Yes. Before we get to the specific issues that prompted me to call you earlier or last week to have this discussion, for those that may not be familiar, the term eugenics, what is it and why is this discussion relevant today?
Sure. Eugenics, we call it a pseudoscience now, but it was originally considered a legitimate science. And basically it worked around the theory that, as with agriculture, where you can mix and combine, take in, mute out different characteristics and traits within animals and within plants, that you could also do that with people. And in doing it with people, you could build a better nation by building a better society. So in the same way that genetically, it is believed that your height, your weight, your eye color, your hair color, textures, and things like that come from your parents. It is also believed eugenically that it's a hereditary issue where if you have liars, cheaters, poverty, different characteristics that are in parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, that they work within the DNA to actually, or the germplasm to be a part of every successive generation. So you can foretell the future of children before they're even born based upon the parents or the grandparents or the great-grandparents. So our society worked eugenics into its foundations almost from its inception. And it's gone towards most of our policy making, our theories about what is an American, what is patriotic, what is citizenship, and following that, into our social policies, including education, housing, economics, and things like that. So we are popularly living with eugenics every day.
So not only was there a scientific aspect of this, as you've been talking about the genome, and if your father was a thief, if your mother was less than a virtuous woman, chances are the kids are going to be thieves and less than virtuous. That this was transmitted genetically through the gene pool. But there's also a mental aspect of this as well. There's propaganda that has been used or utilized and is still being utilized to validate these misperceptions.
Oh, absolutely. So when I do the eugenic framework for Acumen, I look at it as scientific, as social, and then as popular. And so there are overlaps always within those spaces. But how do you determine what is beauty, the beauty aesthetic? Well, if you connect it to health, then it's now a part of your fitness. If you connect it to fitness, then it becomes a part of the science. So you automatically have people now, today, who are taking injections of different types of drugs in order to make their bodies look a particular way, because they're being told scientifically this is safe in order to make you fit socially into a better space that'll make you healthy and happy. But in a social and popular way, it affords you fitness, and it affords you access, and it affords you mobility. And so very slowly what you start to have is a society that's never happy, and that's constantly attempting to fulfill some void that says that they're unfit or unhealthy in a way that they were never necessarily designed to be. God didn't clone us for a reason.
God didn't, I'm sorry.
Clone us. He didn't clone us.
Like Dolly the sheep.
Exactly.
Cherie asks, what year was eugenics created? Now that's an interesting question.
Well, you've had eugenic theories around almost since the beginning of time. So if you're a Christian person, you can read biblical theory, biblical texts that have some lean towards what is considered to be fit or unfit, who is considered to be acceptable or unacceptable. But within the actual eugenic thread, 1840, 1830, 1840 is when the science itself becomes legitimized. And then moving forward, there's some research that was done on Civil War soldiers that was eugenic in nature and actually uses the term eugenics. And so based on that, I know some people say 1880s, but my research shows that if the research was done on Civil War soldiers as the Civil War was taking place, that it had to have been obviously 1860s when some research was being utilized or data sets were being searched out. And that means that it had to have had at least a formal entry, probably closer to the 1830s, 1840s.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because Kevin Baptiste said, I believe it was the 1880s, and Cherie says this is correct. So if Cherie believes that what you said is correct, then we can proceed, because you obviously are correct. Thank you. So no, I say that jokingly, but in all seriousness, we have a very highly educated following here. And it's questions like this and viewers like this that make the program what it is. So in all seriousness, oh, Cherie, you got it. LOL. Got you. One of the things that you mentioned the definition of beauty. And we now see, for example, and we've seen this for a while, but women taking Botox injections to make their lips bigger, more like ours. We have women getting injections in their butts to make their butts bigger, more like ours. I can remember back being a kid back in the mid 60s, and as the white kids would be calling me all these names, and I'd say, but you all are out here trying to get tans so your skin can look more like the skin you are accusing me of. So go ahead. You know where I'm going with that. Go ahead, please.
Well, when science and social collide often. And so what's popular on the one hand in one stream is antithetical in the other. And so that becomes part of the issue. So what you do is you try and construct as a nation what is considered to be fit. Our Miss America pageant, for instance, was originally a eugenic pageant. And so in addition to these women kind of being paraded out, measurements were being taken of them, x-rays were being taken of them, they were being given tests, eugenic tests, IQ tests, to determine their overall fitness as a representative of beauty for the nation. And so you can understand then, if you have a particular phenotype, a particular structure, a particular body type that's considered to be the nation's body type, that anything that works outside of those parameters can then be called disorganized, unhealthy, illegal, immoral. And so this is where you again start to get people who are trying to fit into one space or the other. Now, please be clear that in eugenics, it's the fit over the unfit. And because of that, you'll have within any particular racial group or geographic area, folks who are trying to either align with or work contrary to these theories and these themes. So within the Black community, you can't change the way your body structure is. It is what it is. And so you come up with your own rubric for what's considered to be fit and unfit within that group. Within a Native American group, it may be something different that they either pull to or push away from. And so as a nation, though, there's a reason why if you take the popular, that's one thing. If you take the social, that's something else. But genetically and medically, if you're still speaking in eugenic terms, it means that you have groups of people, white people even, who are considered to be too pale. And if you're too pale within that eugenic construct, you're as sickly or dysgenic or as unhealthy as a Black person would be, or an immigrant would be, trying to fit into that American framework, if that makes sense to you.
It makes perfect sense. And I'm just want to quickly highlight something, and a lot of folks may not remember this, but Bo Derek, and I don't remember the movie, but when
10.
she got the 10, when she got the braids in her hair, that blew the minds of a whole bunch of folks. Am I right? And
just the fact that you would name the film 10. She's the top of the line. This is, you don't get beyond a 10. All right. So if she's a 10, she's buxom, she's blonde, and now she's looking sort of like a Black woman. All right. So what are you saying?
Going back to my point about when I was a kid, why are white folks spending so much time trying to tan and trying to get their skin darker when they accuse me of being inferior because my skin is darker than theirs?
Well, on a very psychic level, when you hear different liturgies say things like, in order to have your days be long, you honor your mother and father. Mother and father is not the mother and father you were born with, but your ancestors. So if you understand clearly that your ancestors look like me, if on a plantation you're calling me auntie and calling you uncle, it's clear that we have a shared bloodline, even if it's not something that we necessarily want to discuss. And so, you know, there's certain things in American history and global history that we don't wish to talk about openly, but it's there. And so I think eugenics brings the rubber to the road.
We're going to be talking today more so about eugenics and propaganda in media. And I always go back to Edward Bernays and his book Propaganda. And I usually read from chapter 1 the following paragraphs, because I think this sets a context for our discussion. Chapter 1, Organizing Chaos. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded. This to me is the important part. We are governed, our minds are molded, Are tastes formed? Are ideas suggested largely by men we have never heard of? This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast members of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society. Our invisible governors are, in many cases, unaware of the identity of their fellow members in the inner cabinet. I draw this correlation often when I talk about this issue. Am I right to use that, particularly as we talk about eugenics, propaganda, and the question of, are we in an information war?
Oh, you're absolutely correct in making the correlation. And we've been in a war for information for quite a while. And the info wars started as soon as you started to have mass media. So there's a reason why you had Black newspapers. There's a reason why you had Black magazines. At one point, it was understood that if you were reading a mainstream newspaper, you could not necessarily trust what was being reported the way it was being reported. As a person who has a journalism background, 30 years as a news reporter, as an editor, I can tell you there was nothing more vexing to me than to be in a room and have an event take place or have a speaker, especially at the White House, to have a president make an announcement, say something very specific and very direct. And the reporters would leave out, they would go into their little corners, they would start typing their pieces. And when you saw those finished pieces, you would think that the 30 or 40 people in that room had been in 30 or 40 different events. It was about the interpretation of the information. And so it became very, very important that you legitimized the news sources. So it was a reason why the Associated Press, the New York Times, at one point, the Washington Post, that you had Reuters, you had certain news organizations that were trusted above others, because yellow journalism was always around. And it was nothing like going into archives and seeing where you had court cases where Black people were referred to by the N-word, where you got to see if a riot or something broke out, the commentary that was placed in a space where it was just supposed to be the facts. You understood that you weren't necessarily getting the facts. You were getting the opinion of one person who was then legitimized by his editor or by the paper itself. But that was the official word. And that was the person that you went with.
You mentioned yellow journalism. I take that back to Randolph Hearst, from the Hearst papers. That was a title, a specific title relative to journalism of the time. We still find it today. It's just not referred to as such. What was yellow journalism, for those that don't know?
It was, you wanted to be the first to get the story out. So if it bleeds, it leads, and you wanted to get people to pick up the newspapers. So what you would do is make it as sensational as possible. So sometimes the headline wouldn't fit the actual story, but you would put your coin down and take the paper so that you could go in and read through it. And a lot of times what you started to read in the story was not necessarily the facts of a particular issue or event that took place, but the opinion of folks who said or did or wanted something, or advertisers. And so you realize that all of the news that you were reading was actually loaded. All of the news that you were reading actually came from someone else sponsoring that information and pulling it into a particular space. So you were being fed information that wasn't truthful. You were being fed information that, quite frankly, was written poorly. But you have someone out on the streets, the news guy and little newsboy, hear ye, and look what I have here, and this is what's happened. And you go, oh my goodness, let's pick up this paper and read it. Also understand, we talk a lot now about literacy, but a lot of people weren't literate in the nation, and still aren't particularly literate. And so what happens is you're listening to someone tell you something, or you're looking at photos, you're looking at infographics, you're looking at trade cards, which are like little postcards that would be at a general store. You're looking at these things, and visually, you're taking in a story. You're being fed a message. Even if you can't read, or you can't read English is your second language, everyone's getting the same message at the same time. in whatever format they're able to access it. And newspapers and yellow journalism was extremely, they just had that down pat. It was such a sensational way of making money that it almost became impossible for legitimate news people to tell their stories properly.
We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we've never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Yellow journalism, Randolph Hearst, Patty Hearst's grandfather, for those who remember the Symbionese Liberation Army and the kidnapping of Patty Hearst, that was her grandfather. In today's parlance, as it relates to social media, that could be considered clickbait. What would be called clickbait, right? A story that flashes on your phone that gets you to hit that, punch that like, and or open up the story and go ahead.
And Wilmer, even more to the point, sometimes the story is set aside by the comments. I find that there's more value to the average American now in the comments than in the actual story. So what you'll find sometimes in newsrooms is that you have someone who works for the newspaper who writes the first comment or the second comment. And so you're telling people what to think about the story that was written, kind of eliminating the need for them to interpret and assess what it is that was written. And
wait a minute,
down the process.
Kevin Baptiste, I got to be sure I thank Kevin Baptiste for that super sticker. Greatly appreciate it. I had forgotten to say that and did not want to miss his generosity. Kevin Baptiste, thank you so much. Finish your thoughts. After my interruption.
It's the comments within the comments section. So it was nothing like you get a news story and you read through it and you start having conversations. The Lear Hour, the reporters roundtables. Dr. Leon, you and I did reporters roundtables, right, where it was all of the news from the week and we're discussing them out a little bit more and folks are listening to us discuss the issues and break them down a little bit further. Well, there's no need for that now if you have a comment section where someone is going to tell you what they believe the issue is, and then based upon those likes and those other comments and the subsequent comments and sometimes the arguments and the debates, which get extremely visceral and nasty, folks with common sense tend to just pull out of the debate altogether and walk away. But it's like a stronghold. And so you're being told what to think about or how to interpret what was written. And so you never actually get a hold of comprehending fully what the issues are. You never really get it. And unless you're a person who sits down and reads intently.
Right.
And a lot of times that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen.
In fact, I'm glad you said read intently, because it's always been important, but it's even more important now to be, you use the word intently, I use the word discerning. You have to be very discerning as a reader. You have to ask yourself, does this story make sense? And you may not even really understand the details and all the dynamics involved, but does this story make sense? And let me give you all an example of this. This is from April 6th. I read this all the time. My former co-host, Garland Nixon, would be laughing because he said, oh, here goes Wilmer again with this story, because I use this story all the time. This was published MSNBC, April 6th, 2022. In a break with the past, U.S. is using intel to fight an info war with Russia, even when the intel isn't rock solid. Quote, it doesn't have to be solid intelligence, one U.S. official said. It's more important to get out ahead of them, the Russians, Putin specifically, before they do something. It was an attention-grabbing assertion that made headlines around the world. U.S. officials said they had indications suggesting Russia might be preparing to use chemical agents in Ukraine. President Joe Biden said it publicly. But 3 U.S. officials told NBC News there's no evidence Russia has brought any chemical weapons near Ukraine. They said, this is the part that is just laughable. They said the U.S. released the information, as in lied, to deter Russia from using banned munitions. I'm going to read that again. The NBC, Joe Biden makes the statement, NBC runs with it. They tell this lie to deter Russia from using the banned munitions. If you've read Plato's Republic, this would be considered the noble lie, a myth or lie that is intentionally spread by an elite to maintain social harmony. What I submit to y'all is it had nothing to do with getting out ahead of Russia. It had nothing to do. Does that explanation even make sense? I'm going to tell a lie that Russia's doing something, even though I know Russia isn't doing it, so I can deter Russia from doing it. What makes more sense? That, or I'm going to tell this lie to convince the American people that Russia's going to do something so I can continue engaging in the behavior that I want to engage in. Dr. Sherman.
Wilmer, if I had to take this to a pop culture vehicle, a number of years ago, there was a film called Wag the Dog.
Mm-hmm.
I would suggest anyone who's not clear, who's having issues, and their conspiracy theories are conspiracy theories, but we also
wait a minute. You use the word conspiracy theory. Folks need to understand who coined the phrase conspiracy theory. The CIA coined the phrase. I'm glad you brought this up because people need to understand this. The CIA coined the phrase conspiracy theory to counter the reporting on the assassination of John Kennedy, to promote the magic bullet theory against those who were saying it could not have been a single assassin, it had to have been a government plot. In order to counter it had to be a government plot, the CIA coined the phrase conspiracy theory. Continue, Dr. Sherman.
It's again, woman, it's just that. So you start to understand. While we're snowed in, find the film Wag the Dog. If you've not seen it, pay attention. If you have seen it, watch it again. This is a part of what it is that politically we tend to do. And I think that once folks realized that it worked in political spaces, they understood it could also work in social spaces. And if it could work in social spaces, it could work in popular spaces. And so right now, years ago, again, what we would do is call this tabloid journalism. It would be in the Star or the National Enquirer. Is something you would pick up in the grocery store on your way out.
Right next to the story that Martians kidnapped my baby and kept my baby for 5 years. Right next to that story.
Exactly. So you start to understand that unless you're a person who's prepared to truly read beyond. And so I would say, again, being that reporter in the room with the AP person and the Reuters person and the New York Times person, and I'm working for a Black newspaper, and then I see all of our stories combined and I'm going, that wasn't the quote. That was not what was said. You're adding things. This is something completely not about what it is that we're supposed to be talking about at this point. You start to understand that millions of people picked up those stories and ran with them. And because they came from these particular news organizations, they didn't question them. It was also about the look and feel of a particular thing. So when most people aren't going to newspapers anymore, they're going straight to the news. And if they're using the news, this sounds really...
what do you mean by that?
This sounds really silly.
Wait a minute. When you say people aren't reading newspapers, they're going straight to the news. What does straight to the news mean?
They're going by rumor, conjecture, and whatever they can find on social media.
Oh, okay.
All right. And so and in that way, as long as you use the term allegedly, then you can post it.
Right.
All right. And that's your saving grace to keep you from being sued. But it's this model that we're using right now where no one really trusts the people who are delivering the news either, because folks want to play with you. All right. So there was a reason why visually, see, because we're visual people. There was a reason why Walter Cronkite, or locally Maureen Bunyan and the J.C. Haywards, the beautiful Black queens that were up there giving news, they presented themselves in a particular type of way so that the news could be trusted coming from them if they are news reporters, if they're newscasters. If you watch the news today, the men may still be in suits sometimes, but the women have on party frocks. It's after 5. It's like, this is way tighter than it needs to be. I know you're given the weather. It makes a difference in the authority that you believe the person has and who you're talking to, who that audience is. And so once the audience starts to change and you have a certain level of disrespect for them, you start to dial it back. You don't have to have the authority where you're wearing a suit. Just as, and I'm going sideways with this, just as if you're a person going into a church, the preacher doesn't have to have a robe anymore to show that he's a part of the clergy and that he is vetted to say and do the things. He can come up there with sweatpants on. It's like, well, as long as he's giving the message. All right. So, but there was in this country, in this nation, how you presented yourself not only gave you authority, but it was a eugenic legitimating of your fitness. All right, these are your qualifications. This is how you're certified. This is how you're supposed to address people. Have you seen people can people get information from TikTok?
I'm going there. Go ahead.
TikTok people giving you information and they have bathrobes on still, or they're laying in the bed talking. And I'm trying to figure out who is listening to this person and taking them seriously when they haven't bothered to shake the dust off them from last night. But they're presenting information and you're steady ticking and leaving comments and you're taking serious hard news from them. Now, the news can come from anyone and anywhere. That is true. But do you trust the news when you're getting it from folks still laying prostrate? I don't get it. So help me to understand it. But again, if you have no middle ground now, so it's either this side or this side. Do I trust the person on the news? Do I trust the person lying on the bed? Or do I say, I'm going to go to get a newspaper and I'm going to read as much as I can. I'm going to backtrack this and I'm going to Dr. Leon and say, hey, have you heard about this? Can you give me some insight? And that tends to be with what most people who are trying to stay above the fray are doing. You can't
which, by the way, is what prompted us to have this conversation. And we're going to get to those stories in a minute. I called you and asked you, was I tripping in thinking this about this? But we're going to get to that in a minute. Two things. One, rumination with Andrew. The stories are also written by several persons. It's customary to see one article written by 3 or 4 people. And thank you, Rumination with Andrew, because the MSNBC piece that I quoted allegedly was written by 4 people, one of whom is the gentleman by the name of Ken Delanian. And what you need to ask yourself about Ken Delanian is, who is he? Well, allegedly, and it is reported, and sources have said, I think I've covered myself well enough there. This may not be true, but he used to write for the LA Times. He no longer reports for the LA Times because it was alleged that with a number of his stories on national intelligence, he used to send the stories to the CIA to have the CIA clear the story before it was published in the LA Times. So some may say, some may argue, it is alleged that he was basically a scribe for the CIA. So he lost his job at the LA Times. He's now on your television on NBC. And he is considered to be a valued resource. I don't know how, as a journalist, you go from writing for a major newspaper like the Los Angeles Times, allegedly getting called out for being a scribe for the CIA, and then I turn on my television and there's the same guy, and this is the story he's writing about, where he says that the where he says that the United States, in a break with the past, the U.S. is using intel. Well, Dr. Sherman, did you ever find the weapons of mass destruction?
I didn't.
You didn't? Oh, what about the yellow cake uranium that was supposed to come from Niger to Iraq? What about the relationship between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden? Remember, those two guys were supposed to, even though we know they were arch enemies, they were supposed to be boys. They were supposed to be collaborating on all of those. So how can Delanian can write in a break with the past? I don't know how he defines the past, but I could go off on this tangent for another hour, which I won't. I just wanted to make that point.
Also, want to pay attention to this for those who are still, if you're still reading newspapers, check inside the front page on usually the third page. They're going to have corrections.
Mm-hmm.
The number of corrections, it used to be 1 or 2 a year. Now it's about 1 page, an issue, an addition. So those are the number of errors that the reporters are making. And so again, you have to vet the information that you take in as fact.
You mentioned Oracle. No, I'm sorry. You mentioned TikTok. And the United States is still trying to ban TikTok. Now, I submit that the main reason, okay, so the premise given as to why the United States is trying to ban TikTok, they say, is that TikTok, because it's owned by ByteDance, which is a Chinese-owned company, TikTok then has access to all this information about the American subscribers to TikTok. I submit that's not the reason. I submit to you that the reason the United States is so hell-bent on shutting down TikTok is because it's the only major social media company in the West that isn't owned by and controlled by the United States. They can't control what TikTok publishes the same way they can control what Twitter publishes, the same way they can control what Facebook publishes. They can't do that with TikTok. And so that to me is because, folks, here's what you need to understand. Ask yourself this: where is the TikTok data stored? I believe TikTok data in terms of in the United States is stored on servers owned by Oracle Computing. Oracle Computing, I think, is based in Texas. So China has to go through Oracle to get that data. It's, to me, and also they're trying to sell off that part of TikTok because it is so valuable. And I'm trying to remember the name of the guy that wants to buy it. He was in the former Trump administration. I think it was a Treasury Secretary under Donald Trump. He's leading the group trying to buy TikTok. Anyway, I just wanted to make that point. Your thoughts?
No, I think you're on point.
Okay.
With all of that, Wilmer. It has nothing to do with the information itself. It's basically, once you're online globally, everyone has access to your information. And I don't think that there is a server anywhere that won't eventually we shop in China. I don't care how it gets to us or what the name of the individual. So our data is already out there and it's being used in different places, and our information is stored in different places because we're not manufacturing anything in this nation. So our information is already there. It's already out there. So it's closer to what you're saying. It has nothing to do with the information being stored up or potentially being used by China. That's just not it.
And remember, Joe Biden tried to establish the Ministry of Truth in the Department of Homeland Security, this disinformation governance board that he wanted to create. He wanted to counter misinformation related to Homeland Security, focused specifically on irregular migration and Russia. Now, folks, let's go back a little bit to the Office of Special Plans, which was in the Pentagon. It existed from September 2002 to June of 2003. It was created by Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith, headed by Feith, and it was the creation of Donald Rumsfeld, who had this office in the Pentagon that would take raw intelligence, give it to George Bush as though it was true, so that George Bush could then come out and tell you there are weapons of mass destruction and all these other kinds of things. And you were talking about the movie Wag the Dog. Well, the CIA and the Pentagon, they have dedicated offices working with Hollywood to craft scripts that glorify war, erase war crimes, promote stereotypes that targeted marginalized groups. You've got movies like Zero Dark 30 and Black Hawk Down that don't just entertain, they manipulate, they push narratives that glorify militarism, justify war, and reinforce racial bias. Dr. Sherman.
Wilmer, and just adding to that, understand that the FCC still exists somewhere, but I don't know where at this point. What tends to happen in eugenic terms is that the pendulum will swing so far in one direction that it literally flips over like a swing. All right. Right now, there are so many things that are just, they're anti everything. I'm telling people, if you're watching this, your brain cells are dying. There's certain programming that just should not exist. Not that, oh, we're Americans and we have a right to There are things that are just offensive in nature. And it used to be that the FCC had rules and regulations about what could be broadcast at any given point. We're not using those brackets anymore. And so now what you're starting to have are folks who are asking the government to come in and ban this or to ban that, or to take, and that is the case with TikTok on a social space, in a social popular space. You're having parents say, my kid is watching this, or there's no way for me to get my kid off of this. They're walking out into traffic. And I'm going, how are you parenting? Do you have a child that's less than a year old with some type of device in front of them to gauge their attention and keep them focused so you can do other things? And
instead of you being that item.
Okay. And again, that's not a new thing. Parents have always had to try and figure out how to keep their kids busy, but it was not these electronic devices to a point where the child is used to this. And so by the time that kid gets into a classroom where it's a teacher standing in front of them, the child is antsy and jumping, and now you want to give them attention deficit medications and all of these other things. This is a part of the problem. So we're looking at folks, little kids who are being indoctrinated into what it is to be a child with no rules and no regulations. And that's it. Your kid spends more time looking at social media and looking at television and looking at screens than they do looking into your face at this point. And so you're trying to deprogram them by the time they get to school. They're 4 or 5 years old, and you're having to deprogram them. And this is a part of the problem.
And quick anecdote to support that point. When my son was maybe 3, there was and I can't remember the name of the restaurant. There was an an Italian restaurant. They used to have just white paper on the tables, and they'd give the kids crayons. And so when my wife and I would take him to dinner, we'd draw on the table and we'd play tic-tac-toe and we'd do all of these things. And there was a family sitting across from us, and the woman came over to us and she said, "Excuse me, how old is your child?" And my wife said, "Oh, he was either 2.5 or 3." And she says, "He's so well behaved. He's so well mannered. How did you do this?" My response was, "Well, if he couldn't sit quietly in a restaurant, you wouldn't see him in a restaurant." But then we looked over at their kids, and they had 2. They had these devices in front of them, and they were making all this noise. And Sheila and I looked at each other like, "This is not that hard. You just have to engage your child." That's so. Anyway, anecdotal.
But if you as a parent, if you as a parent are also stuck on these devices,
Right.
we're using the television and the streaming as catharsis right now. It's a way of us detaching ourselves from the reality. People are watching. You can watch what you want to watch when you want to watch it. Imagine that. You're going back watching Andy Griffith episodes, and somebody's watching Gunsmoke, and someone's watching
2 of my favorites,
Dallas reruns, and someone's right. So all of a sudden you realize everyone is operating in a feel-good space, so they're unable to cope with other things. That's it.
Gil Scott-Heron told us in B-Movie, the idea concerns the fact that this country wants nostalgia. They want to go back as far as they can, even if it's only as far as last week, not to face now or tomorrow, but to face backwards. That's Trump's MAGA. Make America great again. The country wants nostalgia. So with all of that, let's now move to the stories that prompted this conversation in the first place. I'll start with the one that you brought up. DEA investigation in Chapel Hill area uncovers large-scale drug ring. This is a story from about 4 years ago. 21 people face federal charges as a result of a lengthy investigation into the sale of narcotics on or near college campuses in North Carolina. And trust me, folks, it wasn't North Carolina A&T. It was Duke. Go ahead, Chantella. Why did you find this story so important and relates to eugenics?
There were 2 different aspects of it. One was the fact that because these were college students, they were handled very lightly. This was a whole drug ring that went. It was between 3 different campuses: Duke, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and Appalachia State. And it had been going on for years, and I mean 7, 8 years. All right, and the students are going down to Mexico, and they're supplying the entire campus, these campuses, and they're using the sororities and fraternity houses as the jump off points where you can, and they're buying $1.5 million a year. So this is a major drug enterprise, but they're presenting these kids in their caps and gowns, and they're presenting them as misguided, and they're not the threat or hardened criminals. And it's the language of the articles. We should feel sorry for them. And they actually listed, one reporter said there was a duo of them that they caught at one time. And they said the drug dealing duo and the college student clients that they had. These are college student clients. Listen to this. This sounds like you're selling someone a car. It was like, what are you talking about? You don't deal with any other group of people, but they're college students, and they're white college students. And so I wanted to see, but there were 21 different kids that were arrested, that were targeted, that were tried, and only one got a sentence of more than 6 years. And that was the Hispanic guy, Ochoa, Francisco Ochoa. He ended up getting a little over 6 years for his participation. But the rest of them got like 12-month and 18-month prison sentences for this. And I thought that's weird how the language of this almost makes you feel sorry for them, that they kind of got caught up in a bad situation and they won't do it again. And most of them got slaps on the wrist and were just told, this isn't what they do. They were just the victims of some other things. All right. The other part is right. This was not an HBCU. So on the one hand, they're white and on a college campus. And so they're allowed some level of they're the victims, even though they're victimizing others. The other part of this is if they weren't on a college campus at all, they were also of non-white status, even if they were Americans. This would not have read the way it did. And so again, it's about who we consider to be pathological. Eugenically, who do we consider to be a threat? No talk was made of the fact that these were people selling drugs on a college campus with the minds of America being contaminated and all that. This wasn't The Wire. This wasn't the language that you got with The Wire. And it put me in the mind in a popular space of looking at things like Breaking Bad or Nurse Jackie, where you start talking about drugs and addiction. But if it's a white school teacher, high school teacher, and he's a chemistry teacher, and he's creating drugs and manufacturing them on the school grounds, it's something that we celebrate and give 5, 6, 7 seasons to. We're championing him. Nurse Jackie, you're a nurse in an emergency ward in a major hospital. You're sleeping with the supply man with the drugs inside the pharmacy at the hospital so that you can feed your drug habit. But you get 4, 5, 6 seasons and you get Emmy nominations and Emmy nods. And all of a sudden, you're the victim of the fact that life has been difficult and life has been hard. And it's all in how we frame things. There's never a talk about this is a junkie. We never talk about this is a hardened criminal. The language gives you license to accept the bad behavior or the missteps or the thing that's supposed to be pathological in other people. That is strictly eugenic, but we've popularized it to make it okay. And when I saw the sentences for these young people, that's what kind of let me know that art was imitating life and life was imitating art.
So a couple of things. LEJJ says, I have zero idea of what Dr. Sherman is even talking about. So everyone suppressed the story? The answer to everyone suppressed the story is just about yes, because hardly anybody heard this story. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I'm glad you brought up The Wire, and we've talked about this before, but to show how pervasive this is and how insidious this is, the first time I went to Iran, and I've told this story before, but I think it's quite fitting here. The first time I go to Iran, my interpreter says, Dr. Leon, can you do me a favor? What's that, Ali? Can you talk black? What? And then I wanted to go black on him. What? But he says, can you talk black? I said, Ali, am I talking? He said, yes. Am I black? He said, yes. I said, Ali, I'm talking black. He said, no. Like they talk in The Wire. Can you talk like that? I said, no, I can't. Never been in The Wire. Don't want to be in The Wire. That to your point, I think, Dr. Sherman, that shows you how insidious this is, how pervasive this is, how this directly impacts people's perceptions of Black people.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Absolutely. And I would say at one point you again had a network of Black people who talk to each other. And so again, you did have your Black newspapers, but you have folks who talk to each other in the same way. You haven't heard much about this story. And again, this is a story that's 4 or 5 years old. The The arrest and indictments came down 2020, 2021. All right.
Mm-hmm.
But if I were to ask you if you had heard about something called the Junior Lynching League, the Junior Lynch League, you would be surprised to know that there are young Black kids in different school systems across this nation right now who are experiencing racial violence, but the school systems that they're in, and I mean, a young girl sitting on a swing, someone comes up behind her with a rope, pulls it around her neck and yanks her off the swing and drags her while she's at school on a playground. No one jumps in. She frees herself from the rope that's around her neck. All right. And the school system said, oh, the kids were just, it was horseplay. There was nothing to that. You have not seen that story in too many places either. So again, the issue is, where are you getting your news? And if you're stuck somewhere on just your local news, you won't necessarily find these things. But you go and you start digging them out and you realize, oh, this was not one instance here. This was another instance here. There was another instance here. And your school systems, because we don't know who's running the school systems anymore. We're not active in PTA or school superintendent votes and all of this. We have no idea how this is playing itself out unless it hits a national news wave. And even then, we have to rely on the same people that we're saying are guarding the news or shadow banning and all of this to actually present that information and bring it out to you. And so it is imperative that we go through the things that we did years ago where we talk to each other. But we have to get to a point where we're communicating these stories.
And we talk to each other, and because we were reading, we talk to each other about the same story, but in many instances from different sources. Which is why I say to people all the time, they say, well, what are we supposed to do? And the first thing I say, you're supposed to read. Well, what am I supposed to read? Well, I don't care what you read. Just read something.
Yes.
So that we can, because for example, I was going to ask you with the lynching story you're talking about with the girl on the playground. Did that happen in Maryland? Was that a Maryland?
And it was a recent story. This just happened. Right. A couple weeks ago.
About a month ago. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So exactly. You and I are reading about the same story from different sources. And I don't want to get away from the Duke and UNC story because you were talking about how this whole thing was organized. There's an article on this in what's called the Assembly. They were go-to dealers for college students. Now they're headed to prison. One section of this is called the business model. From January 2021 to March of 2023, a blue Toyota RAV4 would occasionally park in the middle of UNC Chapel Hill's fraternity court. Several students said in their trial testimony, prospective buyers would shuffle in and out of the back seat. The Assembly, the paper, is not naming the students. The car would also be found at Pantana Bob's on West Rosemary Street, or on Duke's campus, or at other customers' homes, or at the Lion's Den's barbershop where one of the people worked. And the other thing I wanted to talk about was, over several years, they funneled over 1,000 pounds of marijuana, several hundred kilograms of cocaine, significant quantities of other drugs into these college campuses, and they were making over $1.5 million a year. And so getting back to the earlier point about, LEJJ, you have no idea what Dr. Sherman is talking about. That's what she's talking about. The fact that at some of the major universities in the country, UNC Chapel Hill, go Tar Heels, Duke, go Blue Devils, these white kids are engaged in a major drug enterprise. The brother from DC, what was his name? He just died. Got 30 years in prison for this. Rayful Edmonds. Rayful Edmonds from Southeast DC ran a criminal drug enterprise, basically brought crack cocaine into Washington, DC. He did 30 years in hard time in solitary confinement in a federal prison for engaging in this very same type of behavior. The weight was more, the duration was longer, but the same or similar type behavior. He got 30 years, Gil Scott Heron says, and the rich go to San Clemente.
Hey, that's it. That's it. That's it.
So
you have to engage with this information.
The other story that this is what prompted this whole conversation. New Orleans attacker was, quote unquote, inspired by ISIS, Biden says. Investigators who briefed Biden told him that Shamsuddin Jabbar, a 42-year-old U.S.-born citizen from Texas, had posted videos indicating he had a desire to kill. At least 15 people died in the attack. We're talking about the attack in New Orleans. The suspect had, quote, pledged allegiance to ISIS in several videos posted on his Facebook page the night before the attack. But the 42-year-old also faced pressures. He finalized a third divorce in 2022, saying in filings he couldn't pay his mortgage and his business was losing money. That description is from a totally separate story than what I read at the top. Now, let's compare that to this. Soldier who died by suicide in Las Vegas told ex-girlfriend of pain and exhaustion after Afghanistan. The highly decorated Special Forces soldier who died by suicide in a Cybertruck explosion on New Year's Day confided to a former girlfriend who had served as an Army nurse that he faced significant pain and exhaustion that she says were key symptoms of traumatic brain injury. He had an exemplary military record that spanned the globe and a new baby born last year, but he struggled with the mental and physical toll of his service, which required him to kill and caused him to witness the deaths of fellow soldiers. I read that story and called Dr. Sherman and said, is it me, or are these two instances being treated differently because the guy in Vegas was white and the guy in New Orleans was black? Now, I realize what happened in New Orleans, reprehensible. 15 people died, 30 some odd people were injured. That's horrific. I got it. But to label this guy, in fact, I just heard Chuck Schumer on Meet the Press yesterday say he was a member of ISIS. No. To conflate the act in New Orleans as an ISIS terrorist attack when the story in Vegas is we need to find sympathy for this grieving soldier, that to me was troublesome, Dr. Sherman.
It also is, it's contemporary eugenics in everything that we do. And so if the belief is that Black people are pathological, that if there's a crime, something horrendous happens, then this is a part of the nature of Black people. If a white person does that, there's a causality. He's human and it's fixable, and something triggered him. Something caused him to do this. Something caused him to act out, but he's still one of us. In the other instance, and this is also why you have different sentencing guidelines. This is the reason why, no matter how you look at it, you're saying that genetically, these are two different, I want to say creatures, organisms, because you still have a belief right now that Black people are subhuman, a subspecies. That is still written into the language of our laws. And even if we aren't saying it outright, it was never taken out of the law. And so whether it's, head injuries, how many football players did you have with head injuries, or boxers with head injuries, and you denied them medical treatment or the benefit of repair through lawsuits because you're saying, well, you have to account for the fact that because they're Black, they're inherently more animalistic than they are human, which means they can take the pain. They can take the brain injury because there was very little brain there that was of use to anyone anyway. These are the types of things that if you do not connect the scientific dots to them, you'll strictly say this is racism. It is racism. It absolutely is. But it's also based upon the science and the medical. And because it's based on the science and the medical, it's almost impossible to get the legislation and the policy changed. And we say it's common sense. This is a man. He feels pain. But now you have to go through, he doesn't feel pain like white people feel pain. All right, because he's more this or he's less that. And then you add on the lies and the conjectures about who he's associated with and what his background is, and whatever other traumas he may have experienced as a child that you now say are connected to the fact that he had a poor upbringing and he was raised in poverty, or it was a single mother. It's all of these other things that are stereotypical that you add to this to further make your case that these two people are different, and somehow one deserves the benefit of the repair and the protections of citizenship, and the other one is still just a burden that did not go back to Africa after his usefulness was determined. And so this is what we're living under. So unless and until we start to deal with those types of things, you're going to continue to find the inequity in housing, in education, in the law, in the news, in the television, in the whatever. But as long as we're sitting there eating popcorn and munching along and singing the theme songs and kind of going along with it, and we're not raising hell, this is what you get on the back end of it.
And I talked about the war on terror, which was mythology to begin with. I talked about that at the top of the show. Well, the soldier out of Texas was Muslim, so that Muslim name is a flag. Now, in other stories, it was explained he was on his third divorce. That may signal some mental stress. That his business was failing. That would signal mental stress. But there's very little focus on what was the nature of his mental stress when the guy that blows up the Cybertruck in Las Vegas. Well, we just have to, and I don't say this to minimize anything about anybody. That's not what this is about. But we're just supposed to wring our hands, shed our tears, and say, oh, the guy in Texas, the guy in Vegas, oh, that he was such a troubled soul that he blew up a Cybertruck in front of a Trump hotel. For me, there's an incredible disconnect. And just because the guy had a ISIS flag on the back of his truck, folks, ISIS is, and I say this in the context of the way ISIS is described in the media. I am not saying this to rationalize ISIS behavior. But we've been told since September 11th that ISIS is evil, which they are. That ISIS is just the human manifestation of evil, which they are. But what we find out when we peel back the onion on a lot of stories, the United States is funding and backing and training ISIS. A la the story in Syria with Amir al-Jilani, the guy that was leading the rebels in Syria. He's ISIS. But we're hailing him as a hero. In fact, there's a story in the Wall Street Journal that he was probably a CIA operative, because they're asking the question, how did he wind up on the battlefield after serving 5 years in a U.S. prison in Iraq with bags of cash to fund the overthrow of the Syrian government? So he's okay as ISIS. In fact, he was second in command. But the guy in Texas is evil. They both are. They both are. What they both did was evil. The question is, why aren't they treated equally? Okay.
Can't afford.
All right.
You can't afford to do that. The news can't afford to do that. That's not what we do in this nation.
That's just an inherent conflict in the messaging.
Absolutely.
That's the point that separate story and final question for you. Do you think the music industry seems to reward rappers who promote narratives of violence, drugs, and misogyny? Is this a form of modern propaganda? And how does it connect to the historical efforts to control and degrade marginalized communities?
That's an entire book. But
which you're working on now.
I'm going to use Denise Nicholas. And I think we did this once before, Wilmer, the actress who was in a number of wonderful Black actresses. Room 222. I knew you were saying it.
I was in love with Denise Nicholas.
She said at one point that Black people have always just been beautiful and creative and wonderful. And then when we go out to sing or to dance publicly, a lot of times we would close our eyes because it wasn't about the gaze of other people on us, but about us
getting in touch with what's right,
expressing ourselves and just being wonderfully us. But when someone came through and decided that they could put a value to that spiritual creative thing that we have, we stopped being us. And we started to commodify what it was and who it was that we were, to a point where you can't see our authentic selves too much anymore. So once again, the FCC was there to make sure that at one point you weren't going to be talking about bees and hoes. You weren't going to put that on the airwaves. Now, years ago, you had Millie Jackson who was talking all types of stuff, but that was an album that you put up on the top shelf that you played after hours, and there was no radio station that was going to play the saucy version of her songs. Okay, that's gone out the window. So once again, you have to ask yourselves why. The other question, eugenically speaking, is believed that Black people only have two appetites, one for sex and one for food. All right. And it is believed that as long as those two are satisfied to debauchery, to pathological levels, that we are satisfied and we're quiet and we're okay. Put a backbeat to it and we're going to be okay. Let people think that we're creating things. So you have more Black people who run or own record labels right now. But what are they producing? So it's about training the mind once again, so that those who actually have control, whether they're Black or white, say, how does the money come in? If the money comes in with me telling someone to bend over and shake, or me saying derogatory and nasty and hateful things, or being counterintuitive and the guns and da-da-da-da-da and showing the drugs or whatever, then that is what I'm doing because that is what makes money. And once the money became the issue and not the consciousness, this is what you have. So I think that there's enough blame to go around with this. I think that it's time that we kind of go back to I don't like the respectability politics, but I think some things are just common sense. And I know common sense ain't common, quote unquote, but it's late in the day. It's late in the day. And so you have to figure out as a people how you want to be represented. What do you want your children to see of you and of other people who look like them that impacts how they navigate this system? And if you want to call it white supremacist, I call it white frailty, whatever you want to call it. How do we get them to navigate the system without coming out traumatized and victimized and all of these other things? Right. It makes no sense for a Black child today to say that they want to be a pimp or a stripper. If you're 7, 8 years old, you shouldn't even know what that is. You understand? So there's some work for us to do that's irrespective of them, because they've been doing what they do all along. The question is, what are we supposed to be doing right now to counteract that? And to make sure that we come out of this hole. All right.
Daniel Drazenovich, thank you so much for the super sticker, and appreciate your compliment that this is a great show. Anytime I have Dr. Sherman on. I just want to make the point about the music, because I was at Hampton in 1977 when rap music first hit the scene. And it was Kool Moe Dee. It was the Fat Boys. It was Spoonie G and the Treacherous Three. Folks, go back. And I also was in Queens, New York in the summer during that time, going to cookouts, listening to the freestyle. This was before they were even putting this on records. These were just folks in the backyard throwing down. But they were talking about themselves. They weren't talking about gangsta this and ho that. No, they were talking about their skills as rappers. They were battling as rappers, their skills as lyricists and as rappers. They weren't talking about shooting people, stabbing people, killing people, selling rock and all that other kind of stuff. When the music first was generated, go back and listen to the Fat Boys, right? And this is so then I ask all of you to do this. There's an album called The Narrative. It's by a rapper by the name of Sho Baraka. SHOBARAKA. Sho Baraka. The album is The Narrative. Go and listen to that album. My humble opinion, one of the top 5 rap albums ever that nobody's ever heard of. And there's not a curse word in it. There's not violence suggested in it. It's all positive expression about the Black existence, what's happening in our neighborhoods. Sho Baraka, The Narrative. Find that album and listen to that, and then scratch your head and go, well, why am I listening to this other garbage? Why am I listening to Lil Wayne and Jay-Z and listen to that, and you will have listened to something.
Absolutely.
Dr. Chantella Sherman, as always. Oh, Kevin Baptiste knows show is dope. Kevin, see, Kevin's hip. Kevin's hip. He's on the mothership. So Kevin, I'm right. Obviously Kevin knows I'm right. Anyway, wait a minute. I'm in late, but we got Holistic Politics from Finland. Holistic Politics, you are supposed to be getting the entire country of Finland to listen to this, to watch this show. I don't know where you've been, but Holistic Politics, I appreciate you finally coming back. Don't know where you've been. But anyway, hey, Dr. Sherman, as always, dear, thank you so much. Stay dry, stay warm, stay out the snow, because we're supposed to get a foot before this whole thing is over. As always, I greatly appreciate your insight, greatly appreciate your time.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
All right, folks, check out Sho Baraka, The Narrative. It's the bomb diggity on that one. Thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. Stay tuned for new episodes every day. Also, please follow, subscribe, leave a review, share the show, follow on social media. You can see all the links below in the show description. Remember that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge, because talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. See you all again tomorrow. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a great, great day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.